Between the spring of 1992 and the winter of 1994, 8 men died across West Baltimore in what appeared to be unrelated incidents. Robberies gone wrong, arguments that turned fatal, traffic stops that escalated without witnesses. The Baltimore Police Department investigated each death separately, found no pattern, closed most cases unsolved. But in the dice games and card rooms that operated in basements and vacant row houses across the neighborhood, people understood. 8 men connected to one refused debt, all dead within 24 months. The perpetrators weren't a gang or a crew. They were 3 members of the Price family, 2 brothers and a cousin who'd grown up on the same block, who'd never been known for violence, who'd built their reputation on being predictable and fair. What law enforcement never understood was that the debt itself didn't matter. The $200 was pocket change in the informal economy that sustained West Baltimore when everything else had collapsed. But the public refusal to repay, the laughter that accompanied it, the message it sent about who mattered and who could be safely ignored, that was worth 8 lives. If you have the courage to hear this story, leave your like and subscribe to the channel. But I warn you, this narrative contains extreme violence based on real events. West Baltimore in the early 1990s occupied roughly 6 square miles of row houses and storefronts that stretched from North Avenue down to the harbor approaches, bounded by the Gwynns Falls to the west and Martin Luther King Boulevard to the east. Population density meant you were never truly alone. Approximately 90,000 people packed into a space that had once housed thriving industrial operations, but now contained mostly empty factories and boarded shopfronts. The neighborhood had been built to serve manufacturing, steel, shipping, textiles, but by 1992, those industries were memories. The Bethlehem steel plant at Sparrows Point had shed thousands of jobs through the 1980s. Clothing manufacturers had moved production overseas. The port still operated but had mechanized to the point where a fraction of the workforce could handle what had once employed entire communities. What remained was a landscape of economic absence. Winter mornings in West Baltimore meant waking to temperatures that hovered around 30 degrees, rising maybe to 45 by afternoon. The air smelled like diesel from city buses grinding through their routes, fried chicken from corner carryouts, and underneath it all the particular scent of old brick and concrete that had absorbed decades of exhaust and weather. The sound of the place was children walking to schools that had lost their accreditation, women waiting at bus stops for jobs that paid minimum wage when they paid at all. And every few blocks the bass-heavy thump of go-go music or hip-hop from speakers pointed out windows, because that's what you did when silence felt like death. The row houses stood in unbroken lines, most built between 1900 and 1930, narrow 3-story structures with white marble steps that families once scrubbed daily as a point of pride. By 1992, some families still maintained that tradition, but many had given up. The steps crumbled, marble cracked by freeze-thaw cycles and the weight of time. Windows were barred where they weren't boarded. The city had cut streetlight maintenance, so whole blocks went dark after sunset. But 1992 wasn't just another hard year in Baltimore. The city was hemorrhaging population, down from nearly 1 million residents in 1950 to barely 700,000 now, and falling. White flight had drained tax revenue in the 1960s and 70s. Middle-class black families followed in the 80s, moving to the suburbs when they could afford it, leaving behind those who couldn't. The formal economy had collapsed into day labor, off-the-books construction work, and public assistance that never quite covered rent and food both. Unemployment in West Baltimore hit 41% that year. For men aged 18 to 35, the number was closer to 60%. In places like this, informal economies weren't criminal enterprises. They were survival mechanisms that filled the space where legitimate work used to be. Dice games operated in basements and vacant houses. Card rooms ran in apartments where the electricity still worked. Numbers runners took bets on daily combinations that might pay out enough to cover a light bill or buy groceries. The law said it was illegal. The neighborhood said it was the only economy left that actually functioned. Raymond Price was 31 years old that spring of 1992, though people who knew him said he looked older. He stood 6 feet tall with a lean build that came from metabolism rather than any conscious effort. His face was angular with high cheekbones and deep-set eyes that gave him a perpetually thoughtful expression. A scar ran through his left eyebrow, souvenir from a childhood accident involving a bicycle and a parked car that made him look slightly skeptical even when he wasn't. Every morning, Raymond woke at 5:30 in the row house on North Carey Street, where he'd grown up, where his mother still lived on the second floor, where his grandmother had lived before dying in 1989. He'd make instant coffee, the cheap stuff from the Korean grocery on Pennsylvania Avenue, and sit at the kitchen table smoking Newports while planning his day. He worked when work was available. Day labor through a temp agency on Edmondson Avenue, loading trucks, moving furniture, whatever paid cash, and didn't ask too many questions. The work was sporadic, maybe 3 days a week when things were good, sometimes none. But Raymond's real income came from gambling, not the games themselves. He played conservatively, broke even more often than he won, but from organizing them. He knew who had money and who needed action. He knew which locations were safe from police sweeps and which had heat on them. He knew the mathematics of odds well enough to never take bets he couldn't afford to lose. In the informal economy of West Baltimore, that kind of knowledge had value. People paid for reliable action the same way they paid for reliable anything else. Raymond had never married, no children that he claimed. His mother had raised him alone after his father died in 1974. Industrial accident at the port, crushed between shipping containers while Raymond was 7 years old. That death had taught him something about unpredictability, about how fast everything could change. He'd learned to value stability, to create systems that functioned the same way every time, to be the person others could count on when everything else was chaos. His younger brother Dennis was 28 that spring, built heavier than Raymond, 5'10", but thick through the shoulders and chest, from years of moving furniture and hauling construction materials. Dennis worked more regularly than Raymond did, had a job at a warehouse in South Baltimore that paid $9 an hour when he showed up on time. He'd done 2 years at Baltimore City Community College studying business administration before money ran out, and he had to work full-time. He still talked sometimes about going back, finishing his degree, maybe getting an office job somewhere clean and heated, but everyone knew it was just talk. The debt from those 2 years sat on him like physical weight, and adding more seemed impossible. Dennis lived 3 blocks from Raymond, shared a basement apartment with a girlfriend named Tamara, who worked at the Social Security Administration downtown. They had a daughter, Keisha, who was 4 years old and the center of Dennis's world. He talked about her constantly, what she'd said that morning, what she was learning in pre-K, how smart she was. Raymond would tease him about it, but gently. Everyone knew Dennis was trying to build something different from what they'd grown up with, trying to create stability for his daughter that he'd never had. Their cousin Marcus was 33, older than both brothers, but never quite the leader. He stood 5'9", carried himself with a quiet watchfulness that made people forget he was there until he spoke. Marcus had done time, 3 years at Maryland Correctional Institution for distribution of cocaine, released in 1988. He'd come out different, quieter, more careful. The prison time had taught him that consequences were real, and that the street credibility people died for didn't mean anything behind walls where nobody cared about your reputation from before. Marcus worked security at a nightclub on Pennsylvania Avenue, Thursday through Saturday nights, which meant he saw the worst of what people became when they drank too much and had something to prove. He'd broken up fights, called ambulances for stabbings, watched police haul away bodies after shootings in the parking lot. The work paid under the table. $200 a week, enough to cover rent on the efficiency apartment he kept on Fulton Avenue. What connected all three of them wasn't blood alone, though that mattered, but a shared understanding of how to survive in a place where formal rules had stopped applying. They'd grown up watching men get rich selling drugs only to end up dead or imprisoned within 2 years. They'd watched men fight over corners and reputation, watched them die for disrespect that nobody remembered a week later. The Price family had chosen a different path. They stayed small, stayed quiet, kept their word, and created value through predictability in an unpredictable world. In underground gambling, reputation was everything. Not reputation for violence. Violence was common and therefore worthless as currency, but reputation for fairness, for keeping games honest, for paying debts immediately and never pressing debtors beyond their means. Raymond, Dennis, and Marcus had built that reputation over years. When Raymond organized a dice game, people showed up knowing the game would be straight. When Dennis lost money, he paid the same night. When Marcus vouched for someone, that person could play on credit because Marcus's word meant something. This reputation was their protection. In a neighborhood where police intervention was reactive at best, showing up after violence, not before, the only safety came from being someone others needed alive. The Price family wasn't feared, but they were trusted, and trust in West Baltimore's informal economy was worth more than fear because fear had to be constantly reinforced, while trust could compound over time. The code that governed underground gambling was simple in principle, but complex in practice. Debt wasn't leverage or profit. It was acknowledgement, a recognition that both parties operated under the same rules, that the game would continue, that relationships mattered more than individual transactions. When you borrowed money to keep playing, you were acknowledging the lender's standing in the community. When you repaid that debt, you were confirming their status. The money was almost secondary. This meant that refusing to repay wasn't a financial decision. It was a public declaration that the lender's status no longer carried weight, that you didn't recognize their standing, that the rules they operated under didn't apply to you. In formal economies, that kind of repudiation might mean lawsuits or damaged credit scores. In informal economies where legal recourse didn't exist, it meant something else entirely. The catalyst came on a Friday night in late April 1992, temperature still cool enough that you needed a jacket after dark. Raymond had organized a dice game in the basement of a vacant row house on Edmondson Avenue, one of his regular locations. The building had been empty for 3 years, copper piping stripped out long ago, electricity cut off, but someone had run an extension cord from a neighboring building, where the power still flowed, providing light from 2 work lamps that cast harsh shadows across concrete floor and exposed brick walls. 7 men showed up between 9 and 10 p.m., the usual crowd plus 1 new face. The stranger was mid-20s, introduced himself as Kenny but didn't offer a last name. Someone said he was from over east, from Johnston Square, visiting family in the area. Raymond didn't know him but allowed him to play because one of the regulars vouched for his money being good. The game was craps, played with standard rules but informal betting, side bets between players rather than against a house. Stakes started small, $20 here, $50 there. Kenny won early, doubled his money in the first hour, seemed to know what he was doing. Then his luck turned. By 11:30, he'd lost everything he'd won and was into his original stake. By midnight, he was down $400 and asking to play on credit. Raymond nodded to Dennis, who kept the mental ledger of who owed what. Kenny kept playing, kept losing. The dice turned cold for him in a way that felt almost personal. At 1:15 a.m., Kenny was down $1,200. He set the dice down, looked at Raymond with the expression of a man who'd just realized he'd made a catastrophic mistake. "I need time," Kenny said quietly. His voice was steady, but his hands were shaking. "I got the money, just not on me. Need maybe a week." Raymond looked at Dennis, who nodded. A week was reasonable. They'd seen men lose more and pay back over months without issue. "You good for it?" Raymond asked. Not a threat, just a question that needed answering. "Yeah, I work construction, get paid Thursday. I'll have it Friday next week." "All right, Friday, here, same time." They finished the game around 2 a.m. Kenny left owing $1,200 to 5 different players. Raymond held the largest share at $400. Dennis was in for $300. 2 other regulars held $200 each, and Marcus had spotted Kenny $100 late in the night when nobody else would extend credit. The following Friday, Kenny showed up at 9:45 p.m. Raymond was already there, setting up the lamps. Kenny walked in carrying a paper grocery bag folded over at the top. He looked nervous but determined. "Got something for you," Kenny said, setting the bag on an overturned milk crate they used as a table. Raymond opened the bag. Inside were bills, 20s, 10s, 5s, even some ones, counted out and banded with rubber bands. $1,200 exactly. But before Raymond could take the money, Kenny pulled the bag back. "Actually," Kenny said, and something in his voice changed, became harder. "Actually, I've been thinking about this, about what happened last week, and I don't think I owe you shit." The basement went quiet. Dennis and Marcus had arrived minutes earlier and were standing near the entrance. The 2 other players who'd been owed money were on their way. But in that moment, it was just Raymond, Kenny, and a bag of money that should have been changing hands but wasn't. "Come again?" Raymond's voice was calm, almost gentle. He'd dealt with reluctant payers before. Usually it was embarrassment or pride, easily managed. "I said I don't owe you. Game was rigged. Had to be. Nobody loses $1,200 in 2 hours on straight dice unless the game's crooked." Kenny's voice was rising now, gaining confidence from his own words. "So actually, you owe me, all of you. You cheated me out of my money and I want it back." Raymond looked at the bag of money, looked at Kenny's face, saw something there that made his stomach tighten. This wasn't about the money. Kenny had brought the full $1,200, which meant he had it, meant he could pay. But he was choosing not to, choosing to reframe the debt as fraudulent, choosing to make this public. "Kenny, the game was straight. You know it was straight. 7 people there, everyone watching the same dice. That's what you say. I say different." Kenny picked up the bag, held it against his chest. "And I'm keeping this. Consider it compensation for your bullshit-rigged game." Dennis stepped forward. "Man, you trying to play us? You lost fair. You know you lost fair. Now you trying to flip it like we the criminals?" "I'm saying I don't owe you shit. And if you got a problem with that, take it up with," Kenny gestured vaguely, "whoever, police, courts, whatever. But we both know you ain't gonna do that because the game was illegal to start with. So basically, this is street rules now. And street rules say if I don't pay, there ain't nothing you can do about it." He smiled when he said it. Actually smiled, like he was explaining something obvious to children. Marcus moved toward the entrance, blocking Kenny's exit. Not threatening, just positioning himself. "Kenny, you walk out that door with that money, you understanding what you doing." "Yeah, I'm understanding that I'm $1,200 richer and y'all just learned an expensive lesson about running crooked games." "This ain't about the money anymore," Marcus said quietly. "You know that, right? You making this about something else entirely." Kenny looked at Marcus, looked at Raymond and Dennis, seemed to calculate odds in his head. 3 men between him and the door, but none of them armed, none of them known for violence. He'd done his research. The Price family didn't operate that way. Yeah, I know what I'm doing. I'm doing what I should have done last week. Told you to go fuck yourselves. Kenny pushed past Marcus, who let him go. Not worth a physical confrontation over $1,200. Not when it would bring police attention they couldn't afford. They watched Kenny climb the basement stairs and disappear into the night, taking the money with him. $1,200 and something infinitely more valuable. The Price family's reputation for being able to collect debts. Word would spread. By Monday, the whole neighborhood would know that Kenny had refused payment and walked away. And once that story circulated, every debt the Price family held would become questionable. Raymond stood in the basement for a long time after Kenny left, Dennis and Marcus waiting for him to speak. The work lamps cast harsh shadows that made everyone look older, more worn down. "We got a problem," Raymond said finally. His voice was still calm, but there was something underneath it now, something cold. "Man's a thief," Dennis said. "Straight up thief. We should..." "Should what?" Raymond cut him off. "Beat his ass? Then we got police attention. Take it to someone bigger. Then we look weak, like we can't handle our own business. Go to his family. Maybe they don't care. Maybe they side with him. Either way, we're spending time and energy on something that ain't gonna end the way we need it to. So what? We just eat it? Let him walk with our money and our reputation?" Marcus's voice was tight with anger he rarely showed. Raymond was quiet for another moment. "We try the right way first. We talk to people who know him, see if someone can convince him to do the right thing. We give him a chance to fix this before it becomes what it's going to become." "And if he don't fix it?" Raymond didn't answer, didn't need to. They all understood what the alternative looked like, even if none of them wanted to say it out loud. Over the next week, Raymond made inquiries through people who ran in Kenny's circles, sent word through 3 different intermediaries that Kenny should reconsider, that there was still time to make this right, that refusing to pay was going to create problems bigger than $1,200. Kenny's response came back through the same channels, and it was consistent. The game had been rigged. He didn't owe anything, and if the Price family had a problem with that, they could try to do something about it. The 3rd time Kenny refused, he added something new, told the intermediary to tell Raymond that street rules mean the bigger man wins, and y'all ain't big enough to do shit. The message was clear. Kenny had decided that the Price family's reputation for nonviolence made them safe to rob. Their predictability, the very thing that had protected them for years, had become a vulnerability. They'd built trust by being reasonable, by not escalating, by finding peaceful solutions. And now someone had calculated that reasonableness meant weakness, that trust meant they could be exploited without consequence. Dennis found Raymond on a Tuesday afternoon in mid-May, sitting on the marble steps of their mother's row house on North Carey Street. The temperature had climbed into the 70s, first real warmth of spring. Children were playing in the street, their voices carrying in the way they only did when schools were out, and summer felt close. "Talked to police," Dennis said, sitting down next to his brother. "Took me 2 hours to even find someone who would listen. Finally got a detective who let me explain the situation. And he laughed. Said it was an illegal gambling debt and they don't enforce those. Said if I had proof Kenny took money that wasn't his, I could file a civil suit. Otherwise, I should consider it a life lesson about breaking the law." Dennis's voice was bitter. "Basically told me we on our own." Raymond nodded slowly. He'd expected as much. The Baltimore Police Department was stretched thin, focused on homicides and drug trafficking. A gambling dispute didn't even register as a priority, but he'd needed to know for certain that official channels were closed before considering unofficial ones. "Mama know about this?" Dennis asked. "Yeah, told her last week. She said the same thing she always says. Nothing worth killing over, nothing worth going to prison for. Let it go and move on. You gonna listen? Raymond watched the kids playing in the street. One of them was Dennis's daughter, Keisha, throwing a rubber ball against a wall and catching it in rhythm. She was laughing, completely innocent of the calculations happening 15 feet away. I'm thinking about what happens if we let this slide, Raymond said quietly. We got maybe 20 people out there owing us money right now. Small amounts, 100 here, 200 there. They paying because they know we're good for collecting. They know the game is fair. They know the rules apply to everyone. But if word gets out that Kenny stiffed us and nothing happened, how many of those 20 people suddenly decide they don't have to pay either? All of them, Dennis said. Every single one. And then what? We got no income, got no reputation, got nothing except the knowledge that we let someone make us look weak and everyone saw it. They sat in silence for a minute, watching Keisha play. A car drove past, windows down, go-go music, thumping bass so heavy you could feel it in your chest. Normal afternoon in West Baltimore, life continuing its patterns while two brothers calculated the math of violence. You talked to Marcus? Dennis asked. Yeah, he says it's on us. Says we got to decide if we're willing to pay the price for letting this go, or if we're willing to pay the different price for doing something about it. What price you think is higher? Raymond didn't answer right away. He was thinking about his father, about the randomness of that death, about how fast everything changed. He was thinking about all the men he'd seen over the years, who'd chosen violence to protect their reputation, men who were dead now or locked up for life. He was thinking about Keisha playing in the street, about the future Dennis was trying to build for her, but he was also thinking about the code that governed their world, about what it meant when that code stopped functioning. In formal economies, you had contracts and courts and mechanisms to enforce agreements. In informal economies, all you had was reputation, and once that was gone, you had nothing. You became prey. I think, Raymond said slowly, that either way, we pay. Question is, which payment lets us survive? That evening, Raymond, Dennis, and Marcus met in the basement apartment Dennis shared with Tamara and Keisha. Tamara had taken Keisha to her mother's for the night, sensing something was happening that she didn't want to know details about. The three men sat around a small kitchen table covered with bills and newspaper and the accumulated debris of daily life. We got options, Raymond said. He'd been thinking about this constantly for 2 weeks, mapping out possibilities. Option 1, we let it go. Take the loss. Accept that our reputation takes a hit. Maybe rebuild over time. That ain't a real option, Marcus said. You know it ain't. Word's already out. We got people asking if it's true Kenny stiffed us. We got debtors who suddenly can't be found when we call. It's already happening. Raymond nodded. Option 2, we escalate to someone bigger. Put word out that we'll pay for Kenny to get hurt. Let someone else handle it. Then we look like we can't protect ourselves, Dennis said. Plus, we owe whoever does it, and they know we're desperate. That's worse than the debt we already got. Option 3, Raymond said quietly. He didn't finish the sentence. Didn't need to. Marcus leaned back in his chair. You ready for what option 3 means? Because there ain't no taking that back. That's a line you cross once and you on the other side forever. I know. Do you? Because I done time, Ray. I seen what happens to people who think they ready for that life and find out too late they ain't. You kill a man, you don't just kill him. You kill part of yourself too, and you better be sure you can live with what's left. Raymond looked at his cousin, saw the weight Marcus carried from his years inside, from choices he'd made that had seemed necessary at the time. You saying don't do it? I'm saying make sure you count the full cost. Not just what happens to Kenny, what happens to us, what happens to every relationship we got, every person who knows us. You become known for this, you become only this. No going back to being the fair guys who run straight games. You become the guys who killed a man over $1,200. It ain't about the money, Dennis said. It never was. It's about him saying we don't matter, him saying our rules don't apply to him saying he can take what's ours and laugh about it. I know what it's about, Marcus said. Question is whether what it's about is worth what it costs. They sat in silence. Somewhere above them, in one of the other apartments, a baby was crying. Someone was cooking dinner. The smell of onions and meat filtered down through vents and gaps in old construction. Life continuing its normal patterns while 3 men debated murder. Here's what I think, Raymond said finally. I think if we let this go, we're done. Not today, not tomorrow, but eventually. Debts won't get paid, games won't run straight, everything we built disappears, and we end up exactly where we started, broke with no way to earn except whatever day labor we can find. So we protect the business by killing someone. Dennis's voice was uncertain. That's what we doing, killing for business. No. We protect the principle that debts get paid and rules get followed, because without that principle there is no business. There's just chaos and whoever's got the biggest gun that day. Marcus pulled a cigarette from his pocket, lit it even though they were indoors, even though Tamara would be pissed about smoke smell later. If we do this, he said, exhaling smoke toward the ceiling, we do it right. Not personal, not sloppy, and not just Kenny. What do you mean not just Kenny? Dennis asked. I mean if we just take out Kenny, everyone knows why. It's too obvious, too direct. Police look at us first, we got problems we can't handle. But if Kenny's just the start, if other people connected to him start having problems too, then it looks like something else. Looks like he was into stuff that had nothing to do with us. Raymond felt something cold settle in his chest. You talking about 8 men. However many it takes to make it look like a pattern that ain't about us. Kenny plus everyone who was there that night. Everyone who saw him refuse to pay. Everyone who heard him laugh about it. We spread it out over time, make each one look different, make it seem random. By the time anyone connects the dots, it's too late to prove anything. That's... Dennis stopped. He'd been about to say that was crazy, that was too much, that was crossing into territory they couldn't come back from. But he looked at his brother's face and saw Raymond was already there, was already making the same calculation Marcus had made. 8 men over how long? Raymond asked. 2 years, maybe longer, spread out enough that each one seems separate. Different methods, different circumstances. Some look like robberies, some like arguments that escalated, some like wrong place, wrong time. Nothing connects them except us, and we make sure nobody knows that connection. Dennis stood up, walked to the window, looked out at the street where his daughter had been playing hours earlier. We do this. We ain't the same people anymore. We ain't the same people now, Marcus said. Kenny already changed us. Question is whether we change into victims or into something else. They didn't decide that night. Couldn't decide something that large in one conversation. But over the next 3 weeks, as more debts went unpaid and more people made excuses about why they couldn't cover what they owed, as the Price family watched their income dry up and their reputation dissolve, the decision made itself. Not through discussion or debate, but through the slow accumulation of evidence that letting it go meant accepting permanent defeat. On June 12, 1992, Kenny was found dead in an alley off Pennsylvania Avenue at 3:30 in the morning. He'd been shot twice in the chest during what police determined was a robbery. His wallet was missing, his pockets turned out, his shoes taken. The investigation lasted 9 days before being classified as unsolved. Nobody came forward with information. Nobody seemed to know why Kenny had been in that particular alley at that particular time. Raymond, Dennis, and Marcus were together that night, playing cards at Raymond's house with 4 other people who could testify they'd been there from 10 p.m. until almost dawn. They'd planned it that way, establishing alibis while someone else handled the actual work. They'd paid a junkie $200 to approach Kenny on the street, to start an argument over nothing, to pull a gun Raymond had acquired through channels that couldn't be traced back to him. The junkie had done exactly what he was paid to do, then disappeared into the network of abandoned buildings and shooting galleries where police wouldn't bother looking for him. When news of Kenny's death circulated, Raymond felt nothing. No satisfaction, no guilt, no emotion at all. Just a cold certainty that they'd crossed into new territory and that there was no path back to who they'd been before. But Kenny's death didn't solve the problem. It created a new one. The 5 other men who'd been in that basement the night Kenny refused payment, they knew what the debt had been about. They'd watched Kenny walk out with the money. They'd seen the Price family's humiliation. And if any of them talked to police, if any of them made connections, the whole thing would unravel. So 3 months later, in September 1992, one of those men died in a house fire on Fulton Avenue. The fire marshal ruled it accidental, electrical malfunction in old wiring that should have been replaced decades ago. The victim had been drunk, passed out on a couch when the fire started, never woke up. Raymond had made sure the electrical malfunction happened, had made sure the victim was drunk enough not to notice smoke until too late. But to anyone investigating, it looked like the kind of tragedy that happened every year in old Baltimore row houses with bad wiring and no money for repairs. Another 3 months, another death. This one looked like a drug deal gone wrong, the victim shot in a vacant lot in Sandtown, his pockets empty, every sign pointing to a robbery during a transaction. Police investigation focused on known dealers in the area, never looked at the Price family, who had no connection to drug trade and no obvious motive. The pattern continued. 8 men who'd been connected to that dice game died over 24 months, each death appearing isolated, each investigation going nowhere. A mugging that turned fatal, a traffic stop that escalated when the victim reached for something police thought was a gun, an argument outside a bar that ended with a knife, a fall down a row house's front steps that broke the victim's neck in a way that could have been accident or could have been push, impossible to prove which. Raymond, Dennis, and Marcus didn't handle all the deaths themselves. They'd learned from Kenny's death that direct involvement was too risky. Instead, they orchestrated circumstances, created situations, paid people who needed money badly enough not to ask questions. They moved like administrators rather than executioners, managing a campaign that required patience and precision rather than violence. And it worked, not in the sense of bringing back the reputation they'd lost. That was gone forever the moment Kenny walked out of the basement with their money, but in the sense of creating a new reputation. After the 4th death, after people started noticing that men connected to Kenny kept having fatal accidents, the informal economy of West Baltimore shifted. Debts got paid, games ran straight, nobody refused payment anymore, at least not to the Price family. Raymond found himself living 2 lives simultaneously. In one, he was still the person who organized dice games and played small stakes, who helped his mother with grocery shopping, who showed up to Dennis's daughter's birthday party and played with her like nothing had changed. In the other, he was someone who'd killed 8 men over 2 years, who'd calculated that protecting a principal was worth that cost, who'd crossed a line and found he could function on the other side. The weight of it settled differently on each of them. Marcus handled it best. Prison had already shown him what he was capable of, had already broken him and reformed him into someone who could compartmentalize violence. Dennis struggled more, started drinking heavily, fought with Tamara about things that had nothing to do with what was really wrong. She knew something had changed, but couldn't identify what. Their relationship began dissolving in ways neither of them could repair. Raymond found that he'd become someone people feared. Not openly, nobody talked about the deaths in connection to him, but in the way people moved when he entered a room, in the way conversations stopped and restarted when he approached. The trust he'd built over years had transformed into something else. Not respect exactly, more like an understanding that crossing the Price family carried consequences that went beyond money. The Baltimore police never connected the deaths. Each investigation stayed separate, each case eventually going cold. But in the neighborhood, people understood. Not with evidence or proof, but with the kind of knowledge that circulates in communities where formal law has stopped functioning. They knew that refusing to pay the Price family had resulted in 8 funerals. They knew that whatever the specific circumstances of each death, the underlying cause was the same. Kenny had made a choice, and that choice had required a response that expanded beyond him to everyone who witnessed it. By the winter of 1994, the last of the 8 men was dead. Raymond stood at the man's funeral, stood in the back of the church where the victim's mother was crying and his children were asking why Daddy wasn't coming home, and felt the full weight of what they'd done. 8 men who'd made the mistake of being present when Kenny refused payment. 8 men who might have talked, might have made connections, might have threatened the new order the Price family had established. Were they all guilty? Most had done nothing except witness an event. Some had probably forgotten about it entirely until their deaths made it relevant again. But guilt or innocence was almost beside the point. They'd been threats to a system that couldn't afford threats. In the mathematics of survival that governed informal economies, potential risk and actual risk merged into the same category. After the funeral, Raymond drove through West Baltimore, past row houses where he'd grown up, past corners where he'd played as a child, past the spot on Edmondson Avenue where the basement game had happened 30 months earlier. Everything looked the same buildings, same streets, same people struggling through the same impossible circumstances. But he knew that underneath the sameness, something fundamental had shifted. The Price family had answered the question that every participant in underground economies eventually had to face. What do you do when the rules stop working? When debts don't get paid and agreements don't hold, and the only enforcement mechanism is the one you create yourself? They'd chosen to rebuild the rules through violence, to demonstrate that principles would be protected regardless of cost, to show that their version of order would be maintained even if it required 8 funerals. And it had worked, in the narrow sense that their income had recovered and debts were being paid again. But Raymond understood that success and failure weren't binary categories in what they'd done. They'd saved their livelihood by destroying 8 families. They'd protected their reputation by becoming known for mass murder. They'd enforced the rules by proving that rules were ultimately arbitrary, maintained only by whoever had the will to kill for them. Detective James Whitmore from the Baltimore Police Department's Homicide Division had investigated 3 of the 8 deaths. By early 1995, he'd started seeing patterns that bothered him. Different victims, different circumstances, but all of them connected to West Baltimore gambling circles. All of them having died within a 30-month window, all cases unsolved. He brought his concerns to his lieutenant, laid out the connections, suggested maybe they should look at these deaths as related rather than isolated. The lieutenant looked at the files, looked at Whitmore, shook his head. You got 8 separate incidents spread over 2 years. Different weapons, different locations, different motives. Some are robberies, some are arguments. One's a house fire, one's a traffic stop gone bad. You're seeing a pattern because you want there to be a pattern, but patterns require evidence and you don't have any. I got 8 dead men who all ran in the same circles. This is West Baltimore. Everyone runs in the same circles. Doesn't mean their deaths are connected. The lieutenant closed the files. You got actual evidence tying these cases together? Witnesses, physical evidence, anything beyond your gut feeling? Whitmore didn't. The Price family had been careful, using intermediaries, establishing alibis, spacing deaths far enough apart that each investigation stayed separate. There was no evidence because they'd planned it that way. Write it up, the lieutenant said. Put your theory in a memo, send it up the chain, but don't expect anyone to reopen 8 cases based on a hunch. We got 23 unsolved homicides from last month alone. Resources go to cases we can actually clear. Whitmore wrote the memo. It got filed somewhere in the department's bureaucracy, and nothing came of it. The deaths stayed classified as separate incidents, forever unsolved. Part of Baltimore's background noise of violence that no one had time or resources to fully investigate. Raymond Price lived with what he'd done for 18 more years. He continued organizing games, continued being the person others trusted to keep things fair. But something essential had changed. The predictability he'd offered was now backed by demonstrated willingness to eliminate anyone who threatened it. Trust had become fear wearing trust's mask. Dennis left Baltimore in 1997, moved to Atlanta with a new girlfriend after Tamara finally left him. He started over, found work in construction, tried to build a life separate from what they'd done. But the weight followed him. He drank too much, couldn't maintain relationships, found himself startling at sudden noises and seeing threats in normal interactions. The violence he'd participated in had rewired something fundamental in how he processed the world. He died in 2003 from liver failure, 41 years old, his body destroyed by alcohol he'd used to manage memories he couldn't escape. Keisha, his daughter, was 15 when her father died. She barely remembered him sober. Marcus continued working security, continued living in his efficiency apartment, continued being the person who'd already survived prison and therefore knew that consequences were real. He handled the weight better than the others because he'd already been broken and rebuilt. The violence they'd done together was just an extension of violence he'd already participated in through dealing drugs. Same calculus, different product. He died in 2011 from complications of diabetes, 52 years old, in a hospital bed with no visitors. The obituary listed no survivors. Whatever family he'd had was gone or had cut ties long ago. Raymond outlived both of them. He stayed in West Baltimore, stayed in the same row house where he'd grown up, stayed in the informal economy that had required 8 deaths to maintain. He got older, his hair went gray, his joints began hurting in ways that reminded him he was mortal. In 2010, a young man approached him at a dice game, someone new to the neighborhood who didn't know the history. The young man lost badly and asked for time to pay. Raymond granted it without hesitation. A week later, the young man returned with the money and tried to refuse payment, tried to claim the game had been rigged. Raymond looked at him for a long moment, this kid who couldn't have been more than 23, who was trying to replicate what Kenny had done 18 years earlier. And Raymond felt something close to pity. "Take your money and walk away," Raymond said quietly. "Pay what you owe and we're done. No problem, no issue." But the game was straight. You know it. I know it. Everyone here knows it. But I'm giving you a chance to make this right before it becomes something else. The young man looked around at the other players, saw something in their faces that made him recalculate. He paid what he owed and never came back to Raymond's games. Later, someone asked Raymond why he'd let the kid disrespect him like that, why he'd accepted payment after the kid questioned the game's fairness, why he hadn't made an example the way he had with Kenny. "Because," Raymond said, "I already know what happens when you make examples, and the price for protecting your pride is higher than anyone can afford to pay." He died in 2018, 77 years old, in the same row house where he'd been born. The obituary listed him as a lifelong resident of West Baltimore, survived by various nieces and nephews and extended family. It mentioned that he'd been a fixture in the neighborhood for decades. It didn't mention the 8 men who died because of him, the families destroyed, the system of violence he'd created to maintain an informal economy that had disappeared anyway as Baltimore continued collapsing into something else entirely. At his funeral, fewer than 20 people attended. The neighborhood had changed. Gentrification was pushing into West Baltimore, row houses being renovated and sold to young professionals who knew nothing about dice games in basements or the code that had once governed those spaces. The informal economy Raymond had killed to protect had mostly dissolved, replaced by nothing, leaving behind only poverty and memory, and people trying to survive through whatever means remained. Detective Whitmore, retired now, read Raymond's obituary in the Baltimore Sun and remembered the memo he'd written 23 years earlier. Remembered 8 deaths spread over 2 years, all connected to gambling circles, all connected to a man named Raymond Price, who'd somehow been present in the background of multiple investigations without ever becoming a suspect. He thought about calling someone, about sharing his theory one more time. But what would be the point? Raymond was dead. The victims were dead. The cases were closed and would stay closed. Justice, in whatever form it might take, wasn't coming. The story of the Price family and the 8 men who died to maintain their reputation didn't end with justice or redemption. It ended with 3 bodies in graves, 8 more bodies in different graves, and a neighborhood that had moved on to new crises, while the old ones faded into the background noise of accumulated violence. There's no clear moral, no satisfying conclusion where right triumphs over wrong. Just a truth about what happens when formal systems collapse and informal ones have to be maintained through force. Just a question about whether protecting principles through murder makes those principles worth protecting or destroys them entirely. Raymond Price killed 8 men over 30 months to demonstrate that debts would be paid and rules would be followed in an economy where those things couldn't be legally enforced. He succeeded in the narrow sense that his business recovered. He failed in the larger sense that success required destroying what he'd been trying to protect, the trust and predictability that had made his operation valuable in the first place. In the end, the only certainty is that violence compounds. Kenny's refusal to pay required his death. His death required 7 more deaths to cover the first. Those deaths required Raymond, Dennis, and Marcus to become people they might not have become otherwise, and all of it together created a weight that none of them could carry without breaking. If this story made you think about informal economies, about the price of reputation, about what happens when systems fail and people create their own rules through force, leave your like and share this video. Subscribe to this channel for more true stories that challenge what we think we know about justice, about survival, about how ordinary people become capable of extraordinary violence when pushed into corners with no exits. Comment below. Where do you draw the line between protecting what's yours and becoming what you fear? What would you have done in Raymond Price's position? Because these stories aren't just history, they're happening right now, somewhere, in places where formal law doesn't reach, and people make impossible choices based on codes that demand blood for blood. Until next time, remember, the systems we trust to keep order are fragile, and when they fail, the alternatives people create are often worse than the chaos they're meant to prevent. No one investigated what happened to the intermediaries, the 3 men Raymond had sent to Kenny with messages, asking him to reconsider, to make it right, to understand what refusing would mean. They vanished from the calculation entirely once Kenny's death established the new pattern. But Marcus thought about them sometimes. thought about how they'd carried messages between two parties without understanding they were witnessing the countdown to something irreversible, thought about how their knowledge made them liabilities in a system that couldn't afford loose threads. 2 of the 3 intermediaries were among the 8 dead. The third moved to D.C. in late 1992 and never came back to West Baltimore, never explained why he left so suddenly, never responded when old friends tried to reach him. Marcus wondered if that man woke up sometimes knowing how close he'd come, understanding that geographic distance was the only thing that had saved him from being corpse number 9. The basement on Edmondson Avenue where the original game had happened stayed vacant for another 7 years after Kenny's death. Nobody wanted to run games there anymore. The space had acquired a reputation, the kind that circulates without anyone saying it directly. Young dealers would use it sometimes to stash product, and occasionally homeless people would sleep there in winter when the cold got bad enough that concrete walls felt like shelter. But the gambling moved elsewhere, to locations that didn't carry the weight of what had started in that particular basement. Raymond walked past the building sometimes, part of his regular route through the neighborhood. Each time he'd glance at the boarded entrance and remember the exact configuration of bodies that night, where Kenny had stood when he pulled the money back, where Dennis had been positioned near the wall where Marcus had moved to block the exit. The memory was precise down to smallest details. The smell of mildew and old brick, the harsh shadows from work lamps, the specific tone of Kenny's voice when he'd said street rules like he was teaching them something they didn't already know. What stayed with Raymond most wasn't the violence that followed, but that particular moment when Kenny smiled. The smile had contained such certainty, such confidence that the Price family's reputation for reasonableness meant they were safe to rob. Kenny had done research, had asked around, had determined that Raymond, Dennis, and Marcus didn't operate through violence and therefore could be treated as marks rather than threats. The smile said, "I know who you are and you're not dangerous." That smile had been the actual catalyst, not the refused debt. Money could be recovered or written off, but being correctly assessed as non-threatening, being accurately identified as people whose principles made them predictable enough to exploit, that couldn't stand. Because if Kenny could see it, others would too. And once that perception solidified, their entire position in the informal economy would collapse. So the violence hadn't been about punishment or revenge. It had been about correction, about demonstrating that the previous assessment was wrong. That predictability didn't equal weakness, that principles could be maintained through force when necessary. 8 deaths to prove that the Price family was dangerous after all, that their earlier restraint had been choice rather than incapacity. But correcting that perception required becoming the thing they'd spent years avoiding, required transforming from trusted operators into killers, required trading one form of protection, being needed alive because you were fair, for another form, being kept alive because you were feared. The transaction was irreversible. You couldn't go back to being non-threatening once you'd killed 8 people to prove you were. Tamara figured it out sometime in late 1993, almost 18 months into the campaign. Dennis never told her directly, maintained operational security the way Marcus had taught them, but she'd been with him long enough to read changes others might miss. The drinking had started right after Kenny died. The nightmares came a few months later. The way he'd started flinching at sudden noises, the way he'd check windows before sitting down, the way he'd position himself in restaurants so he could see all the exits. Those were newer developments appearing incrementally as the body count rose. One night in November 1993, after the 6th death, she'd waited until Keisha was asleep and then sat Dennis down at their kitchen table. Didn't ask questions, didn't demand explanations, just said, "Whatever you're doing with Raymond and Marcus, you need to stop." Dennis had looked at her with eyes that were already somewhere else, already processing threat assessments she couldn't see. Can't stop, already too far in. Then get out. Leave Baltimore, take me and Keisha and just go somewhere new. Doesn't work like that. You start something like this, you have to finish it. Otherwise you're the loose thread, and loose threads get cut. Tamara had understood then. Not the details, she never wanted those, but the shape of it. Dennis had gotten involved in something that only ended one way, and she could either stay and watch him disintegrate or leave and save what could be saved. She'd chosen to stay for another 3 years, trying to hold together a relationship with someone who was disappearing into himself one day at a time. But eventually, the weight of Dennis's unspoken knowledge became too heavy for both of them to carry, and she'd taken Keisha and left. Dennis never blamed her, told Raymond she'd been right to go, that staying near him put her and Keisha at risk they didn't deserve. He'd set up child support payments through a lawyer, money from gambling income that probably should have been taxed but wasn't, and made sure Keisha had what she needed even as he fell apart. The maintenance of that responsibility, the continued provision for his daughter despite his deteriorating state, was maybe the last piece of who he'd been before Kenny's smile had started a chain reaction that led to 8 funerals and his own slow suicide through alcohol. The house fire that killed the second victim had been Raymond's design but Dennis's execution. They'd needed someone to go inside the row house on Fulton Avenue while the target was passed out drunk to strip old electrical wire insulation at a specific point near the couch where he was sleeping, to create a short that would generate heat and sparks, to make sure the fire would start small enough, not to wake him immediately, but grow fast enough that escape would become impossible before consciousness returned. Dennis had done the electrical work, had learned basic wiring from construction jobs, knew enough to make it look like decades-old infrastructure finally failing. He'd entered through a back window at 2 a.m., worked for 15 minutes in near darkness using a penlight, exited the same way he'd come in. The fire started 40 minutes later, gave the victim maybe 3 minutes between first smoke and flames blocking the exits. The man had died from smoke inhalation before burns could take him. Small mercy that Dennis clung to afterward, as if method of death somehow mitigated the fact of it. But making someone's death look accidental required getting close to them, required being in their space, required seeing the life you were about to end in intimate detail. The victim's row house had been full of normal things: family photos on walls, children's drawings held to refrigerator with magnets, a birthday card on the kitchen counter from someone who loved him. Dennis had seen all of it in penlight beam while creating the electrical fault that would kill the man sleeping 20 feet away. That was the job that broke something in Dennis. The others Kenny shot in an alley, the third victim killed in what looked like a drug robbery, those had distance. You could maintain separation between action and consequence when you weren't standing in someone's kitchen looking at their daughter's artwork while preparing their death. But the house fire required proximity that made abstraction impossible. Dennis started drinking heavily right after that one, started waking up at 3 a.m., remembering the smell of that kitchen, the photos on the wall, the specific squeaky sound the back window had made when he'd opened it to climb inside. The drinking was supposed to blur those memories, make them less precise. Instead, it just made him less functional, while the memories stayed sharp. Marcus tried to talk to him about it. In early 1993, tried to explain that the weight got easier to carry if you accepted it instead of fighting it. "You can't undo what's done," Marcus had said. "You can only decide whether it was necessary or not. And if it was necessary, then feeling bad about it doesn't change anything except making you less effective at staying alive." "How do you know it was necessary?" Dennis had asked. "How do you know we didn't just kill people because we were angry? because our pride got hurt, because Raymond couldn't stand being disrespected. Doesn't matter now, necessary or not, it's done. And we got two choices: carry it or collapse under it. No third option where we go back and choose different. But for Dennis, there was a third option, the one he'd been working toward since Tamara left. Drink until the weight felt lighter, until memory softened, until the space between who he'd been and who he'd become got small enough he could exist in it without constantly measuring the distance. That option led to liver failure at 41, led to Keisha growing up without a father, led to dying alone in a hospital bed because everyone who might have visited was either dead or had good reasons to stay away. The fourth victim died in what looked like a mugging outside a corner store on Pennsylvania Avenue. But it wasn't random street crime. It was orchestrated the same way Kenny's death had been, using a junkie desperate enough for payment that he didn't ask questions about why this particular victim needed robbing at this particular time. The junkie had approached the target at 11 p.m., demanded money, escalated to violence when the target resisted, stabbed him 4 times in the chest and abdomen, took his wallet and watch, disappeared into the network of abandoned buildings where police couldn't follow. Raymond had paid the junkie $300, $100 up front, $200 after, had provided the knife, a cheap folding blade bought at a flea market with cash, no serial number to trace, had established his own alibi by being at his mother's house playing cards with cousins who'd swear he'd been there all night. The junkie did the work, kept the money and the watch, got arrested 2 months later for an unrelated robbery, and ended up doing 5 years at Jessup. He never connected his brief employment by Raymond to anything larger, never understood he'd been part of a pattern. The system they'd developed was elegant in its simplicity. Identify the threat, create circumstances for removal that looked like normal street violence, use intermediaries who couldn't trace back to them, establish alibis that put them somewhere else entirely. The only flaw was that it required continuing to live in West Baltimore, continuing to be visible in the same spaces where victims had operated. But leaving would have looked like flight, would have suggested guilt, would have drawn exactly the kind of attention they needed to avoid. So they stayed and maintained normal patterns while bodies accumulated. Raymond kept running games. Dennis kept working construction when he could still function. Marcus kept working security at the nightclub. Life continued in its usual rhythms, while underneath they orchestrated a campaign that wouldn't end until everyone who'd witnessed Kenny's refusal was dead. The fifth victim died in a traffic stop gone wrong in December 1993. He'd been pulled over for broken taillight on Monroe Street, routine stop that should have ended with a warning or a fix-it ticket. But when the officer approached the vehicle, the victim reached toward the glove compartment for his registration, and the officer interpreted the motion as reaching for a weapon. The officer fired 4 times, killed the victim instantly, was cleared of wrongdoing after investigation, determined he'd acted within policy given perceived threat. Raymond hadn't orchestrated that death. It was pure coincidence, the kind of random violence that happened regularly in Baltimore when police were jumpy and black men made movements that could be interpreted as threatening. But the coincidence served his purposes perfectly. One fewer person to eliminate, one death that had nothing to do with him, that no investigation would ever connect to Kenny's refused debt 18 months earlier. When Raymond heard about the traffic stop, he felt something close to relief. Not satisfaction, he wasn't glad the man was dead, but relief that circumstances had removed a problem without requiring his involvement. The universe had done the work for him, had demonstrated that violence was so common in West Baltimore that their orchestrated deaths would blend seamlessly into the background noise. That coincidental death taught Raymond something about cover. The best way to hide multiple murders was to commit them in a place where murder was already common. where investigations were overwhelmed and underfunded, where bodies piled up faster than detectives could process them. West Baltimore provided perfect camouflage because violence there was expected, normal, part of the environment like weather or traffic. Their 8 deaths would disappear into annual statistics that showed hundreds of homicides, most unsolved, most forgotten within weeks. The 6th and 7th victims died in the same incident, an argument outside a bar on North Avenue that escalated to gunfire in March 1994. The circumstances were murky, multiple witnesses, contradictory accounts, everyone claiming self-defense or mistaken identity. Police investigation identified a shooter but couldn't prove which person had fired first, couldn't establish clear aggressor versus defender. The case went to trial and ended in acquittal when jury couldn't determine beyond reasonable doubt who was guilty of what. Raymond had orchestrated the initial confrontation, had paid someone to start an argument with the first victim, knowing the second victim would intervene, knowing both men had reputations for carrying weapons and responding aggressively to perceived disrespect. The setup required understanding psychology, knowing how pride and alcohol and history would combine to create violence without Raymond needing to participate directly. He'd created conditions and let human nature do the rest. Both victims died, the shooter walked free, and Raymond was 40 miles away in Ocean City, with Dennis and Marcus establishing alibi through motel receipt and restaurant credit card charges. They'd planned the weekend trip specifically to coincide with the confrontation, to make sure they were documentably elsewhere when the deaths occurred. That double elimination meant only one target remained. 8 men who'd witnessed Kenny's refusal, 8 men who knew about the debt, 8 men who might connect future dots if they stayed alive. 7 were dead by spring 1994. The 8th was a man named Terrell, who'd left West Baltimore right after Kenny died, who'd moved to Philadelphia and started over, who'd demonstrated through his rapid departure that he understood something dangerous was happening. Terrell's exit had been smart. He'd removed himself from the geography where violence was occurring, had put distance between himself and the Price family, had essentially opted out of the calculation. But his survival was still a loose thread, still a witness who could theoretically talk if police ever started connecting deaths and asking questions. Raymond debated for months whether Terrell needed to die. The man had shown good judgment by leaving, had proven he wasn't a threat by staying gone. Killing him would require traveling to Philadelphia, operating in unfamiliar territory, taking risks that might not be necessary. But leaving him alive meant accepting permanent vulnerability, one witness who could undo everything if circumstances changed, and he decided to talk. Marcus argued for elimination. Can't leave it unfinished. We did 7, we have to do 8. Otherwise it's incomplete, and incomplete gets you caught. Dennis argued for letting it go. Man ran. That's basically admission he knows what happened and wants no part of it. Killing him now just adds risk for no benefit. Raymond couldn't decide, kept weighing options, calculating probabilities, trying to determine if finishing the pattern was worth the additional exposure. The deadlock lasted through summer and into fall of 1994. What finally decided it wasn't logic or calculation but superstition. Raymond had committed to 8 deaths as the number required to obscure pattern, to make the killings look unconnected. 7 felt incomplete, felt like it drew attention to the absence rather than concealing it. 8 was clean, was the number he'd settled on, was the count that would allow him to stop and know it was finished. So in November 1994, Raymond traveled to Philadelphia, didn't tell Dennis or Marcus the details, didn't want them involved, didn't want witnesses to what he was planning. He went alone, took a Greyhound bus to avoid creating vehicle records, paid cash for everything. He found Terrell working construction in North Philly, followed him for 3 days learning his patterns. Terrell had a girlfriend, had a job, had built new life separate from Baltimore. He seemed happy in the way people are when they've escaped something terrible and are grateful just to be alive and elsewhere. Raymond followed Terrell to a bar one Friday night, waited until he came out. Alone at midnight, approached him on the street. Terrell recognized him immediately, and Raymond saw fear transform his face into something raw and desperate. "I ain't talked to nobody," Terrell said immediately, hands up, backing away. "I left, I stayed gone. I ain't said nothing to police or nobody else. I don't know nothing about what happened back there." "I know," Raymond said. His voice was calm, almost gentle. "That's why I'm here, to make sure it stays that way." He shot Terrell twice in the chest. Same way Kenny had died. Same caliber weapon acquired through the same untraceable channels. Left him on the sidewalk outside a bar in North Philadelphia. Took the Greyhound back to Baltimore that same night. Police investigation went nowhere. No witnesses came forward. No evidence connected the shooting to anything in victim's background. Case went unsolved and stayed that way. Raymond arrived back in Baltimore on Sunday morning, took a cab from the bus station to his mother's row house, walked inside and sat at the kitchen table where he'd sat thousands of times before. His mother was at church. The house was quiet except for sounds of neighborhood filtering through old windows, children playing, cars passing, the distant sound of someone's music. He sat there for 2 hours without moving, thinking about Terrell's face in those final seconds. The fear had been absolute. Terrell had known he was about to die, had seen it coming, had tried to bargain with information Raymond already possessed. The man's last words had been promising silence, as if that could save him when silence was exactly why he needed to die. That was the worst one. Worse than the house fire Dennis had orchestrated, worse than the staged mugging or the bar fight. Because Terrell had done everything right, had recognized danger, had fled, had started over, and it hadn't mattered. His survival instinct had been correct, but insufficient. He'd understood that staying in Baltimore meant death, but hadn't understood that being a witness meant death regardless of geography. Raymond never told Dennis and Marcus the details of Terrell's death. Just confirmed it was done, that the count was complete, that they could stop now. 8 deaths over 30 months, each one designed to look isolated, pattern obscured by spacing and variation in method. It was finished, but finishing didn't bring relief. Raymond had expected completion to provide some sense of closure, of having done what needed doing and now being able to move forward. Instead, it just brought awareness that he'd killed 8 people to protect his ability to run dice games in West Baltimore. The absurdity of that ratio, 8 lives for underground gambling operation, became inescapable once the immediate threat was resolved. Detective Whitmore's memo in early 1995 came close to unraveling everything. The patterns he'd identified were correct. 8 connected deaths over 30 months, all tied to gambling. Circles, none solved. But without physical evidence or witnesses, pattern recognition was just theory. Whitmore's lieutenant had been right. You can't reopen 8 cases based on a hunch. Not in a city averaging 300 homicides annually. Not when resources are already overwhelmed. The memo got filed and forgotten, but its existence meant Raymond had been right about needing to complete the pattern. 7 deaths might have looked like targeting specific individuals. 8 deaths looked like the kind of clustering that happens randomly in communities where violence is common. Ironically, the thoroughness that Raymond had worried was excessive. Killing Terrell in Philadelphia to reach the number 8 had been exactly what obscured the pattern enough that investigation couldn't gain traction. They never spoke about it afterward, not in direct terms. The subject became something they'd reference obliquely when necessary, but never discussed in detail. Like veterans who'd served together in combat, They had shared knowledge that separated them from everyone else, while simultaneously making conversation about it impossible. What could you say about having killed 8 people? How could you contextualize that to someone who hadn't been there, who hadn't felt Kenny's smile cut through their reputation like a knife, who hadn't understood that accepting the loss would mean permanent irrelevance in the only economy where they could earn? The neighborhood changed around them through the late 1990s and into the 2000s. The informal gambling economy that had sustained them contracted as drugs took over as primary income source for underground operators. Crack had devastated West Baltimore through the late 80s and early 90s, but by mid-90s the market had matured and consolidated. The street-level dealing became more organized, more violent, more profitable than small-stakes dice games could ever be. Raymond adapted by focusing on older players, men his age who'd grown up in the same systems and still valued the relative safety of gambling over drug trade's higher risks. But the income declined steadily. What had once been his primary earnings became supplemental, something he did as much from habit and identity as from financial necessity. He took more day labor jobs, worked more regularly through the temp agency. The work was physically harder as he aged. His knees started hurting in his late 40s. His back developed chronic pain from years of lifting and carrying. But the work was clean in ways his gambling operation wasn't anymore. Nobody died over temp agency labor. You just showed up, moved furniture or loaded trucks, took your cash payment at day's end. Simple transactions without accumulated weight. Dennis's departure for Atlanta in 1997 left a hole in the operation and in Raymond's daily life. They'd been partners for over a decade, had run games together, had killed together, had carried the same weight even if they'd handled it differently. Losing Dennis to geography and alcoholism felt like losing part of his own history, like watching his past disappear one piece at a time. Marcus stayed but became more distant, more isolated. His diabetes diagnosis in 2005 required lifestyle changes he couldn't quite manage. Better diet, regular exercise, monitoring blood sugar, but decades of stress and violence had created patterns that were hard to break. He kept working security, kept drinking too much, kept eating food that tasted good, but destroyed him incrementally. The disease progressed faster than it should have, complications mounting until organ failure became inevitable. Raymond visited Marcus in the hospital 3 days before he died, sat beside his bed in a ward that smelled like disinfectant and dying. Marcus was skeletal by then, body consumed by disease, barely conscious most of the time. But he woke up while Raymond was there, looked at him with eyes that still contained the intelligence that had planned 8 deaths spread across 30 months. "Worth it?" Marcus asked. His voice was barely audible, damaged by intubation and oxygen. Raymond didn't answer immediately. He thought about Kenny's smile, about the $1,200 that had stopped mattering the moment it became about something larger. Thought about Terrell backing away with hands up, promising silence seconds before death. Thought about Dennis drinking himself to death by 41 because he couldn't carry the weight. Thought about sitting here watching his cousin die from disease, probably accelerated by stress their choices had created. "No," Raymond said finally. "Wasn't worth it, but don't know what else we could have done." Marcus nodded slightly, like that answer was what he'd expected. "Same thing. Every time I think it through, end up the same place. Couldn't let it go, couldn't half-ass it, had to finish. But finishing destroyed us anyway. Just different destruction than letting it go would have been." "You regret it?" Marcus thought about that for a long time, his breathing labored and wet-sounding. Regret getting diabetes, regret dying at 52 in a hospital bed with no family. But the other thing? He paused, gathering strength. Did what seemed necessary at the time, with information we had. Regret don't change what was necessary. just makes the carrying harder. He died that night, alone, because Raymond had left and there was nobody else to call. The hospital contacted Raymond because he was listed as emergency contact, asked him to identify the body and handle arrangements. Raymond paid for cremation, cheapest option, all he could afford, and scattered Marcus's ashes in Druid Hill Park because Marcus used to go there sometimes when he needed quiet. Standing in the park on a cold morning in February 2011, spreading his cousin's ashes under trees that had outlived everyone involved in their shared history, Raymond understood that Marcus had been right. Regret didn't change necessity, just made the weight harder to carry. And he'd been carrying that weight for 19 years now, would carry it until his own death, because there was no mechanism for setting it down. Dennis's funeral in 2003 had been larger. Tamara had organized it, had made sure Keisha understood her father despite his failures, had invited family and friends who'd known Dennis before. Raymond had sat in the back of the church, listening to people talk about Dennis's kindness, his love for his daughter, his struggle with demons nobody quite named. The eulogies described someone Raymond recognized but hadn't seen in years, someone who'd existed before Kenny smiled and set in motion everything that followed. After the funeral, Tamara had approached Raymond outside the church. She was 42 then, had remarried, had built stable life for herself and Keisha separate from Dennis's deterioration. But she looked at Raymond with eyes that had known him since they were young, that had watched him change into something else. "Whatever you all did," she said quietly, "it killed him slower than a bullet would have. But it still killed him just as dead." Raymond had no response to that. She was right. The violence they'd committed had killed Dennis incrementally, destroying him from inside while he tried to maintain normal appearance. The alcohol was just method. The actual cause was weight he couldn't carry and couldn't set down. "I'm sorry," Raymond said. Inadequate words for inadequate apology. Sorry doesn't help Keisha, doesn't give her back her father, doesn't undo whatever you did that made him into someone who had to drink himself to death to sleep at night. She walked away after that, back to the car where Keisha was waiting, back to the life she'd built away from Baltimore and away from men who solved problems through violence that echoed for decades. Raymond never saw Tamara or Keisha again. They stayed in Atlanta, stayed away from Baltimore, stayed clear of the history that had consumed Dennis and was consuming Raymond one day at a time. Smart choice. The Price family's protection racket for underground gambling had required 8 deaths and destroyed everyone involved. Why would anyone choose proximity to that? The young man who'd tried to refuse payment in 2010, the one Raymond had let walk away after paying his debt, had been the last test of whether the old patterns still held, and Raymond had passed by choosing different, by accepting that pride and reputation weren't worth more deaths, that the cost of maintaining principles through violence had already been too high. But that choice also meant acknowledging that everything they'd done for Kenny had been wrong. Not wrong in the sense of immoral, though it was that too, but wrong in the sense of strategically unnecessary. If Raymond could accept disrespect in 2010 and continue functioning, then he could have accepted Kenny's disrespect in 1992 and eventually rebuilt through different methods. The 8 deaths hadn't been inevitable. They'd been one choice among many, selected because it seemed quickest and most certain. That realization came to Raymond in pieces through his final years. By 2015, he was 74, still living in the same row house, still organizing occasional games, but more from habit than income. His mother had died in 2009, leaving him the house and enough life insurance to cover property taxes for a few years. He lived alone, had never married, had no children that he claimed. The row house was full of accumulated decades, furniture from his childhood, His mother's belongings he couldn't bring himself to discard. The physical weight of time compressed into 3 stories of narrow rooms. He'd sit sometimes at the kitchen table where he'd planned Kenny's death, where he'd calculated that 8 murders were necessary to protect his reputation. The table was the same one his mother had used for 50 years, formica top worn smooth in spots from thousands of meals. He'd trace those worn spots with his fingers and think about choices, about paths not taken, about all the ways events might have unfolded different if he'd been wiser or braver or more willing to accept temporary loss. But alternate histories didn't change what had actually happened. 8 men were still dead. Dennis and Marcus were still dead. Keisha had still grown up without her father. Tamara had still been right that whatever they'd done had killed Dennis, as surely as any bullet. The weight of those facts sat in the room like physical presence, like additional occupant who never spoke but never left either. Gentrification reached his block in 2016. Young white couples started buying row houses, renovating them into open-concept homes with modern kitchens and exposed brick. Property values rose, property taxes followed. The neighborhood Raymond had known his entire life was being replaced by something else, something that had no space for informal economies or underground gambling or the codes that had governed survival when formal systems had failed. He watched it happen from his marble steps, same steps his grandmother used to scrub that his mother had maintained, that he'd let crumble because what was the point? Watched construction crews gut row houses that had stood for a century, watched new residents move in, young people with good jobs downtown, people who'd never needed to understand how dice games functioned when manufacturing jobs disappeared. The irony wasn't lost on him. He'd killed 8 men to protect his position in an economy that had disappeared anyway. The informal gambling networks that had sustained West Baltimore through the 1990s were gone, replaced by drug trade initially and now displaced entirely by economic forces that had no interest in either. The new residents didn't gamble in basements. They didn't need to. They had formal employment, legal income, access to systems that actually functioned. So what had it all been for? 8 deaths to maintain status in a world that no longer existed. 8 families destroyed so Raymond could continue being trusted organizer of games that eventually stopped happening anyway. Dennis drinking himself to death over violence that had protected nothing permanent. Marcus dying alone with diabetes, probably accelerated by stress their choices created. And Raymond himself living to 77 but alone, untrusted, carrying knowledge that separated him from everyone who might have been friend or family. In his final year, 2018, Raymond's health declined rapidly. Lung cancer from 50 years of Newport cigarettes, diagnosed too late for treatment to matter. The doctor gave him 6 months, and Raymond accepted the prognosis with the same fatalism he'd developed watching neighborhood transform around him. You couldn't change what was coming. You could only decide how you'd meet it. He died in November 2018 in the hospital because dying at home alone wasn't safe when you needed pain management. The end came quickly once it started, consciousness fading, organs failing, body shutting down in sequence that had been inevitable since diagnosis. His final thoughts weren't profound or revelatory, just awareness that he'd lived 77 years, had done some good and considerable harm, and was now completing the same process every human completes regardless of their choices. The funeral was small. Distant relatives who barely remembered him, a few old-timers from the neighborhood who'd known him decades ago, the pastor from his mother's church, who hadn't seen Raymond in years but performed the service anyway. Nobody mentioned the 8 men who died because of him. Nobody talked about Kenny or the debt or the 24 months when bodies accumulated to protect underground gambling operation. That history had died with Dennis and Marcus, had become unverifiable rumor that nobody could prove and nobody wanted to investigate. Detective Whitmore, retired now, 73 years old, read Raymond's obituary and thought about calling someone. Thought about his memo from 1995, about 8 deaths spread over 30 months, about patterns he'd seen but couldn't prove. But who would he call? Raymond was dead. The cases were closed. Justice, if it existed, would have to be satisfied with the fact that everyone involved had died badly. Kenny and the other 7 victims through murder, Dennis through alcohol, Marcus through disease, Raymond through cancer. Nobody had gotten away clean. The violence had consumed all of them. What Whitmore couldn't know, what nobody except Raymond, Dennis, and Marcus had ever known, was how completely the violence had hollowed them out, even while they continued functioning. How they'd learned to segment their minds into compartments where they could be normal and compartments where they'd calculated murder, and how keeping those compartments separate required constant effort that eventually broke Dennis and wore down Marcus and left Raymond isolated in ways that had nothing to do with being alone. The weight didn't get lighter with time. It didn't fade or diminish. If anything, it grew heavier as years passed and perspective shifted. What seemed necessary at 31 looked like catastrophic mistake at 77. But recognizing error didn't enable correction. The dead stayed dead. The families stayed destroyed. The consequences continued echoing, regardless of whether the original actors regretted their choices. If there's a lesson in the Price family's story, it's not about crime and punishment or justice delayed. It's about how informal systems, the ones that emerge when formal structures fail, require enforcement mechanisms that destroy the people who operate them. Raymond, Dennis, and Marcus built their livelihood on trust and predictability in underground economy. When someone violated that trust, they had no legal recourse, no formal mechanism for enforcement. So they created informal mechanism through violence, and that violence consumed them as completely as it consumed their victims. The 8 men who died weren't innocent. They'd participated in illegal gambling, they'd witnessed debt refusal and done nothing. They'd existed in the same informal economy that required rules be enforced somehow. But their deaths were also fundamentally unjust, were murders committed to protect pride and reputation, were killings that served purpose only within a system that shouldn't have needed to exist. And the 3 men who did the killing weren't monsters, weren't predators who sought out violence. They were ordinary people pushed into corner by economic collapse and social abandonment, people who'd tried to create sustainable livelihood in the space where legitimate work used to be, people who'd made one catastrophic choice when their sustainable system was threatened and spent the rest of their lives paying for it. There's no redemption in this ending, no justice, no closure, no satisfying conclusion where right defeats wrong. Just entropy and consequence. Just bodies and graves and knowledge that violence solves nothing except creating more problems that also get solved through violence until everyone involved is consumed or dead. The basement on Edmondson Avenue, where it all started, was finally demolished in 2017, part of redevelopment project that cleared entire block for new construction. The building was gutted, walls torn down, concrete floor broken up and hauled away. Whatever traces remained of the night, Kenny refused payment, the exact spot where he'd stood, the corner where Dennis had watched, the doorway Marcus had blocked, disappeared into dumpsters and got buried in landfill outside the city. Raymond had watched the demolition from across the street, standing in the cold January air while construction crews reduced the building to rubble. 76 years old then, already, sick but not yet diagnosed, watching physical space that held the catalyst for his life's greatest mistake disappear into nothing. He'd felt nothing watching it come down. No relief, no sadness, no sense of closure. Just awareness that erasing the location didn't erase what had happened there, didn't bring back the dead, didn't restore innocence to people who'd lost it over 20 years ago. The building was just brick and concrete. The actual weight was carried in minds and memories, and those couldn't be demolished, no matter how thoroughly you destroyed physical evidence. So this is how it ends. Not with punishment or redemption, but with death from natural causes, cancer and cirrhosis and diabetes, consuming bodies that had already been consumed from inside by violence they'd committed and could never undo. The Price family killed 8 men to protect their reputation and their livelihood. They succeeded in the narrow sense that debts got paid and games continued running. They failed in every sense that mattered. Human cost, psychological damage, strategic necessity, moral justification. Kenny's smile had started it, that moment of certainty that the Price family could be safely robbed because they were known for being reasonable. And Kenny had been right in his assessment. They were reasonable people, fair operators, not prone to violence. But his conclusion, that this made them safe to exploit, was wrong. Because reasonable people pushed far enough become unreasonable, and fair operators protecting their survival become capable of unfair acts. And people not prone to violence can learn violence when they decide it's necessary, and that lesson can't be unlearned even when they later recognize it was never as necessary as it seemed. If this story disturbs you, if it makes you think about informal economies and failed systems, and what happens when ordinary people make extraordinary choices under impossible pressure, then it served its purpose, because these dynamics aren't historical curiosities. They're happening right now in places where formal law has stopped functioning, where economic collapse has created informal systems, where people enforce their own rules because no other enforcement exists. Comment below with your thoughts. Where do you draw the line between protecting what's yours and becoming the thing you fear? What would you have done in Raymond Price's position? Because judgment is easy from distance, but proximity changes everything, and systems that seem stable from outside often look very different when you're inside them trying to survive. Subscribe to this channel for more true stories that don't provide easy answers, that challenge simplistic morality, that show how people become capable of terrible things through series of choices that each seem reasonable at the time but accumulate into catastrophe. Until next time, remember, the informal systems we create when formal ones fail often require enforcement, mechanisms that destroy us, and the violence we think we control always ends up controlling us instead. The Price family learned that lesson over 24 months and 3 lifetimes. Most people don't get the chance to learn it at all before it's too late to matter.